All right, everybody, here we go with Chapter 7, Language Disorders in Early and Later Childhood. The chapter focuses on what is a language disorder, how are they classified, what are the major types of language disorders, and how are language disorders identified and treated. All right, language disorders are defined as impaired comprehension and or use of spoken, written, or other symbol systems. So if we have somebody who has difficulty comprehending or understanding spoken language, written language, sign language, that's going to be a language disorder. If somebody has a hard time using spoken or written or something else like sign language, you got to be able to use at least one of those. If you don't and aren't able to, you then most likely have a language disorder. And language disorders can last throughout a lifetime. They can begin from the very beginning, or they can be acquired. So language disorders can involve delays in language precursors in the first year, right? So when does the babbling start? When does the pointing start? When does that first word come? All those important language things. Language milestones in toddlers and preschool years, so word combinations and longer words and sentences, and understanding words and sentences and being able to follow directions given with language. Into school age, right, struggling with academic skills that rely on language proficiency. That can be writing, reading, speaking, and then it can last into living and working in adult years. Language disorders can involve any, so this can be any or all of form, which is phonology, morphology, and syntax, content of language, semantics, so usually things like vocabulary, and function of language, so pragmatic, so how you're using language, right? Maybe you can read and write and understand language, but are you using it properly, and using it in the way that the culture expects you to use it? And we'll talk more about these as we go. Right, so, and it's important to remember that for something to be a language disorder, it has to impact somebody socially and or psychologically and or educationally and or vocationally at work, right? How's it impacting the person in their daily life and their daily living skills? Always have to remember the difference between a language disorder versus a language difference, right? So if somebody speaks in a dialect, is a second language learner, right, they might be struggling with, let's say, English language skills, but they don't have a language disorder. They're just, using their own dialect or their own language, and it's just going to take them a little bit to catch up and to get to learn English. It certainly doesn't mean they have a disorder of any kind. And then just your book talks a little bit about the meaning of significant. So is it a significant disorder? Does it have a significant, real, meaningful impact, educationally, socially, psychologically, with your family, with work, right? Is something significant going on? Or, is there a difference or a slight, deviation, but it's not a big deal? So usually we're going to talk about language disorders as language impairments, language disorders, language disabilities, and specific learning disabilities are probably the most commonly used terms that we have today. Language disorders are pretty prevalent. About 15% of toddlers are going to be late talkers, depending on how people define that. Usually, if the first word doesn't come around the first 16 months, we're going to describe somebody as a late talker. Those kids are going to be more likely to have a language disorder than others. It doesn't mean they will have a language disorder, but they're going to be at risk for a language disorder. Primary language impairment affects about 7 to 10% of children, over the age of 5. So a primary language impairment, which we've got this later in the slideshow, but let's talk about it now. If you have a primary language impairment, that means that you've got average or above average hearing, average or above average cognition, IQ, and that there's only language going on. So that's maybe 7 to 10% of the population over the age of 5. A secondary language impairment will be somebody has a language impairment, but our sort of understanding, at least, is that is because of something else. So if somebody has Down syndrome, right, they're also going to have a language disorder. The understanding is that they have the language disorder because of Down syndrome. If somebody has autism, they're probably going to also have some kind of language disorder or language needs. Again, that the understanding is that that language disorder is secondary, is sort of caused by, because of, linked with autism. Okay, also head injuries, people with traumatic brain injury are going to be much more likely to have a language disorder. And again, the idea is that it's because of that head injury. A little bit old stats, maybe 2015, I think, about 1.4 million 3 to 21-year-olds receive services for speech language impairment. So, we're talking about a lot of people, a lot of children here getting therapy. How do we classify language disorders? And we're going to use 3 basic things to classify. We're going to use etiology, manifestation, and severity. Let's talk about those. Etiology, anytime you hear the word etiology, it just means cause. So in this case, what's the cause of the language disorder? Is it a primary language disorder, so it occurs in the absence of other disabilities? Or is it a secondary language disorder? It occurs, we assume, as a result of another disability, like we just talked about. And is the disorder developmental, so present from birth, nothing that we know happened, and it was always there, or acquired sometime after birth, right? Usually, often for language, it's going to be due to a head injury of some kind. Or, a head, and it could be stroke if we're talking about older adults, or, some young adults as well. Manifestation, so how does it present itself? What aspects of language are affected? You can have a comprehension language disorder, a language disorder with expressive language disorder, or both. So often people will talk about when we're talking about comprehension, we'll also often talk about receptive. So you can have a specific expressive language disorder, right, where your receptive comprehension is fine, you understand language really well, you can follow directions, you can understand language, but you have a hard time expressing your language. Or you can have a mixed receptive expressive language disorder, but you can't really have a receptive only language disorder, because if you have trouble understanding language, you're going to have a hard time expressing that language. So it really comes down to, do you only have an expressive language disorder, or is it a combination of receptive and expressive language disorder? And again, form, content, and use. If it's a focal disorder, it's a disorder affecting only one domain. So let's say you've got somebody with autism and they have a hard time with pragmatics, where they're not sure how to use language. They sort of have an interesting way of speaking, but their form, their grammar is perfectly, within normal limits, or even above normal limits, and their content is really good, their form's really good. So is it a focal disorder where only one of those domains is impacted, or is it a diffuse disorder where we have trouble with 2 or more of the form, content, and use domains? All right, so reading and writing, right, once we get into preschool and school age, right, the idea of reading and writing becomes super important. And when we do that, we've got to consider both decoding skills and comprehension skills. So with decoding, we're using the alphabetic principle usually to identify spoken word and corresponding written word. The alphabetic principle is just the idea that for the most part, letters are going to correspond to sounds. So if you see the letter R, it usually makes an R sound. A Z makes a Z sound. So that there's a spoken word and a written word, so that sounds go along with the letters. And so the idea behind decoding is, is the person able to understand that alphabetic principle? Are they able to just read? So if you give a third grader a paragraph at their age appropriate level and they're able to read it out loud, then they're doing an okay job decoding. If they struggle with that, they could have a language disorder, and specifically, if they specifically have a decoding difficulty, they may have dyslexia, where making that correspondence between letters and sounds and words is really difficult. It becomes all jumbled for people. Words appear to be out of order, and reading's really hard, so that would be a decoding issue. Then you've got a comprehension issue. So actually that's where you draw the meaning from the text, right? So this could be a reading comprehension disorder. So you can have people that have problems with both decoding and comprehension. So that would be a mixed reading disorder. So if somebody has a difficult time reading, but then also a difficult time understanding, that would be a mixed reading disorder. If you have a third grader who maybe has autism, you give them a paragraph to read and they read it like a champion, no trouble, reading really at or above age level. So the decoding is great, but then you ask them what they read and they look at you like you're crazy because they don't really have any idea what they read. So that would be a decoding. They're doing well with decoding, but they have a comprehension, a reading comprehension disorder. The decoding's fine, right? But if you have dyslexia, you're not going to be able to decode, you won't be able to read, and then obviously you're not going to be able to comprehend either. But then you've got to tease apart, well, can they not comprehend because they have dyslexia, or can they not comprehend because they have dyslexia plus they also, even if they were able to decode, they also would have trouble understanding. So you can have a problem with one or both of decoding and comprehension, right? Severity, we're going to go from mild to severe here. So mild may only be perceptible to the child and the family. A little struggling at school. These kids may or may not receive services. Usually a little extra help is good for a little while, but then, maybe they're taught some strategies, and they don't end up really getting more therapy than that. Once we get up to a moderate severity for language disorders, these are going to be people that really need some sort of accommodations, hopefully therapy plus accommodations in the classroom, and they may really be facing lifelong challenges with understanding and using language. Severe, these individuals are going to typically require extensive modifications to perform well in social and academic settings. So there can be supported employment, community work settings. So if you have a severe language disorder, you're probably always going to have it. It's going to come with you. So it's going to last through work up into your adult years. And someone who has a profound language disorder may really have no language skills at all. Maybe at a 1-year-old, 2-year-old language abilities. These people may really benefit from augmentative and alternative communication, or AAC. That would be maybe using a computer an iPad or a picture book to be able to get their thoughts across can be really helpful. So what are the main types of language disorders? We'll talk about all four of these. We've got specific language impairment, autism spectrum disorder, intellectual disability, and brain injury. All right, specific language impairment, also SLI, is going to be primary developmental language impairment with no known cause. So these are going to be kids who have typical hearing, typical IQ, pretty typical speech overall. So there's nothing else really going on, and it's just language. And this should be typically diagnosed after their third birthday. Right, maybe these are going to be late talkers and they get diagnosed early, but often it starts to come later in preschool and higher level language, and they have a hard time. There's a good YouTube video on that. I encourage you to watch that when you're done listening to the lecture. Defining characteristics of specific language impairment. There are going to be inconsistent skills across different domains. So you might have people that, their vocabulary is age appropriate, so they're doing okay in that content area, but in the form, in the grammar, the syntax, they really struggle, right? So you usually won't see people that struggle the same way in all three areas of content, form, and use. It's going to be maybe their pragmatics are excellent and vocabulary is okay, but grammar and syntax, they really struggle. These kids have a history of slow vocabulary development. So kids that have kind of always been a little bit behind their peers in words, and maybe they don't have as big a vocabulary when they're two. They don't say as many words, shorter sentences, things like that. So these things have always been there, even if they're not picked up, identified till later. There's going to be a tendency toward word finding problems. So difficulties in coming up with the right words at the right time. So these are going to be our kids that are going to use the word like things a lot, stuff. So they're going to use words that, because they can't think of the exact word, they're going to come up with pretty generic words for things. So that's always something to watch for when you're working with these guys and girls. There's going to be considerable difficulty with grammatical production and comprehension that begins during toddlerhood and continues through school age. So these kids might do really well with, reading short sentences when people are being told like a one-step direction, hey, would you go get me blank? They can do fine with that, but when we get to two-stage directions, hey, first can you go get this, and then you're going to have to think about this, right? That's when things are going to start to break down as, the paragraphs get longer. They're expected to talk in longer and longer sentences, right? That's when things are going to really break down and they're going to have difficulty. There's no known cause for specific language impairment. There's a strong biological and genetic component, like, pretty much everything we're talking about. And that, whether or not that shows up is going to also mix with exposure to additional risk factors. So, if we have somebody who, has a sort of genetic predisposition to have a language disorder, but maybe they have parents who, are doing a million different things with reading and writing, and they've got a lot of resources, right? Maybe a child who would have a mild language impairment is going to squeeze over into the average category and never be identified, right? Whereas that same kid who, if they come from maybe a low income family where they're not the resources, there are not a lot of books, that child that might have just a natural mild specific language impairment, they might be moved back to maybe a moderate language impairment. So it's always, everything's a combination between, genetics and environment and exposure, but genetics are going to play a big role here. All right, autism spectrum disorder. This is an umbrella term which describes a variety of developmental conditions. But the most important characteristics, we're going to have significant difficulties in social interactions and communication. So that's that pragmatic idea, that use. So that use category, right? We've got content, form, and use. They're going to really struggle in use, and maybe the others as well, but maybe not. They're going to often engage in repetitive behaviors. So this could be hand flapping, this could be finger tapping, this could be something that, often something to help kind of calm them down, calm themselves down, to sort of make sense of things. I had one guy years ago, a fourth grader. He would come home from school every day with this. This was actually down in Alabama, where it was warm, most of the year. He would come home from school every day. His parents had a pool, and he would immediately put on his swimsuit and jump in and just swim lap after lap. So he'd swim a lap, get out, run to the other side, jump in, swim a lap, run to the other side, jump in, do this over and over again. And that was how he kind of calmed himself, regulated his body, after trying to be with peers and teachers all day long, all that noise, all that sensory, just really trying to self-regulate. And that for him worked really, really well. The idea of overly restricted interests, right? There are some autism adults that would say, hey, with some people you would say someone's really focused and really driven, but why do you say that we're overly restricted in our interest? And I think that's a really good point. If you have young kids with autism, like maybe they really like trains and they're going to talk about trains, whether or not you're talking about trains, they're going to talk about trains because that's what they're interested in. So again, they might have great grammar, syntax, form of language. They might have great vocabulary, content with language, but they only are talking about trains, right? So that's a use issue, a pragmatic issue, right? Not everybody wants to hear about trains all the time. So just sort of helping them, keep their interest in trains. Talking about trains is super fine, but maybe let's talk about other things too. So this is going to go along with our defining characteristics. So in order to be identified as somebody with autism, symptoms must emerge during childhood. Symptoms must affect an individual's everyday functioning, right? If it has no impact on school, on work, on social, on sort of their psychological well-being, then it's not autism. It must include difficulties with social communication and interaction. So if you have somebody with autism, maybe if someone's super mild, they wouldn't need any kind of speech therapy, but there's going to be a big language, social communication, interaction component here. And we as speech therapists can really kind of help to guide, to make just interactions easier for the individual. And again, symptoms must include some sort of restrictive and repetitive patterns of behavior, so that maybe a focused interest, and then also that sort of restricted pattern of behavior where they're going to be doing something to help them regulate and help them get through all this sensory input that we have in our lives. Now, your book talks about Asperger's syndrome, but your book came out just before they got rid of Asperger's syndrome. So Asperger's syndrome is a term that's no longer used. These are going to be kids who will now have mild autism. So in the past, there was no clinically significant delay in language, cognitive self-help, and adaptive behavioral skills, but impairment in two or more of the following in social interaction and behavior, right? So being able to interact, and then maybe there'd be some behavior issues, but we don't use this term any longer, and they'll just be part of the mild autism group of kids. Causes and risk factors. There can be several factors. Again, there's going to be big genetic factors going on here. We've also got prenatal, so during pregnancy, and perinatal during birth, complications, particularly maternal rubella, which is kind of like measles. So if the mother has measles while she's pregnant, that can lead to the baby's going to have an increased chance of autism. Anoxia, which is loss of oxygen before or during birth, that's going to increase chances for autism. Genetic factors, one thing we know is that vaccines definitely do not cause autism. Tons and tons of studies now, tons of data, no difference in incidence between kids that were vaccinated, kids that were not vaccinated. All right, so that's autism. Just a quick nutshell of autism. Did we have a video? I forget. Intellectual disability is going to be another prevailing type or cause of language disorders. So defining characteristics. We can also intellectual disability or intellectual developmental disorder. This is going to be a condition of arrested or incomplete development of the mind, and people with intellectual disability are going to be characterized by impairment of skills manifested during the developmental period. There's a video, watch that YouTube video when you can. So these can be children under 18 whose mental abilities are significantly below what would be expected from their peers. They're going to have problems functioning in society, right? So that those mental abilities are going to impact their functioning, and they're going to have limitations in adaptive behavior and activities of daily living. So adaptive behavior is the ability to map behaviors, actions onto a situation, right? So are they able to kind of make a plan to, how to behave in certain situations and what to do? And then those ADLs, activities of daily living, are really important. So conceptual skills, communication, functional academics, health, and safety. Obviously, these are really important skills. So communicating, just being able to read, write, do some simple math, health and safety. We've got social skills, so relationships, leisure. They might need a lot of help when they're home, right? And that leads us into practical skills, so self-care, home living, work. So, if you got somebody that has a moderate intellectual disability who maybe lives in, a special home or sort of apartment building with other people with intellectual disabilities, and they have nurses and aides who help them with self-care, with being able to live, using the stove, helping them to get to work, helping them to get to leisure activities. So, where are people with these skills, and what kind of help do they need in living, the most fulfilling life they possibly can? So causes and risk factors, most cause cannot be identified. 30% due to some kind of prenatal difference or damage. It could be chromosomal differences. Maternal drug use is a factor. 10% pregnancy, perinatal problems, and viral infections, 5% from trauma, infection, and poisoning, 5% caused by just simple heredity. And remember, a chromosomal difference isn't heredity. So if we're talking about Down syndrome, right, that's a chromosomal difference that just happens, right? It's not necessarily genetic. Also consider, children who are neglected or abused are going to be more likely to have intellectual disabilities, and people with autism will also be more likely to have intellectual disabilities. All right, brain injury. This refers to damage or insult to an individual's brain. It's the leading cause of death and disability among young children, so often an accident, or something like that. Brain injuries can occur in utero, so again during pregnancy, perinatally during birth, and can also be acquired after birth. 1.5 million people each year are affected by brain injuries. By age 15, 4 out of 100 males and 2.3 out of 100 females will have experienced a brain injury, right? This could be during an accident, during sports, right? During some kind of abuse, right? We can have brain injury. So this is a lot of people we're talking about. The most commonly used metric for quantifying consciousness, right? So if somebody gets a brain injury, the most commonly used instrument is the Glasgow Coma Scale. You're going to look at individuals' eye response, right? So are they able to follow an object with their eyes? Are they able to make eye contact with the nurse or speech pathologist giving the scale? We've also got motor responses, so are they able to reach for things that they want? Are they also able to, if you give them, when they get their blood tested and they get their finger pricked, like, do they flinch at all? Like, is there any kind of motor response with that? And then we're also verbal responses, so are they able to answer questions? Are they able to give any kind of yes and no? Or are they nonverbal, right? So, and then we're going to sum up those three areas and they'll get a severity scale for that. All right, so when we're talking about head injuries too, we can have open versus closed head injuries. A closed head injury is where brain matter is not exposed or penetrated. So this is the most common is a traumatic brain injury. Through a car accident, abuse, fall. So your skull is not actually penetrated, right? Nothing's going into the brain itself, but if someone's head hits the windshield, if someone has a big fall and lands on their head, right? And this is going to be associated with diffuse widespread damage to the brain, right? So if somebody's in a car accident, their head hits that windshield, the brain is going to smack against the front of their skull, and then as the car stops and slows down, the brain will also smack against the back of their skull, right? So we've got widespread damage to the brain. It could be a major head injury with really life-altering consequences. Can also have an open head injury where brain matter is exposed through penetration. This can be a gunshot wound, a knife wound, right? Other penetrating wound where something actually gets into the brain, right? And then that's going to result in a focal injury. So the brain's not sort of moving around and slamming against things like it is in a closed head injury, right? But wherever that brain was penetrated, right, they're going to have a lot of difficulty with, whatever area of the brain, with whatever, that area of brain is in charge of, they're going to have a hard time doing that. Language disorders resulting from brain injury are influenced by the severity of the injury, the site of the damage, characteristics of the child before the injury occurred, right? So what was the child's language skills like before the injury happened? And this is a great site here, check that out, to learn more about pediatric brain injury. All right, and that is the end of part 1.